get into the system and we can share it with the community. So that's the context on why I am the person talking about this. So this is my first time addressing this forum. I've made the assumption that being a little later in the day, the future security environment will have been covered. I do believe that it was really well done. Therefore, I wanted to bring back the discussion more to a tactical level, since we now will understand that actions on the ground at the tactical level can absolutely have strategic effects, both desired, but also often not desired. So of note that this is totally unclassified. Because the presentation is unclassified, I will not give accurate details of name of the awesome people I spoke to, and I even remove the countries where I realized that the portion would be available on YouTube. So I was a little crazy on the not putting much information, but it's not. There's no problem if the countries are mentioned in the question. It's just that I didn't want what I was saying to be used from an adverse party. I have asked to remove the slides because they were not that exciting. I just wanted to hide behind them. So to begin, in order to address the topic, countering adversary influence activities in our AOR in the Baltic, how Canadian troops deal with the threat in the information environment, current operations, what I did is I discussed with a number of commanding officers and staff officers who operated or are still in the two areas I will focus on. Originally, I was going to address our presence in the Baltics, but I did add another country that's not a member of NATO, but where we have a training mission, since it's facing the same threats from an information environment perspective. Also notice that our approaches on the ground are very similar in all those countries. As you'll see, what I found was not necessarily surprising. I'm not going to come up with some really thing that you never heard before, but it does put emphasis on some of our practices and what to improve. So the sequence I'll be using to address the topic is really simple. First, I will look at the context and what the troops in my country are doing there. I will also look at the risk to our troops from an information environment perspective. And then, before I conclude, I'll explain what went well, because it went surprisingly well. The context. So we currently have a mission in both countries that I've been circling about previously. It's clear that the adversary's main objective is to deter NATO's influence as a whole. It does differ a bit in both, as one is part of NATO and the other one was getting closer to NATO before the events of 2014, when it lost a piece of its territory. So I just told you which country that was. When I speak to the people in both, they say it's different, which is really funny because then they tell me exactly the same thing. So despite that two areas have slight differences, the practices on the ground that are working are really similar. I've brought examples that I had put in a document that was not too exciting because it was in my text anyways. So it's important to mention, though, that Canadian troops are mainly targeted as part of NATO. They're not necessarily targeted as Canadians. So the messaging, to give you a few examples, goes from things like NATO is provocative and aggressive. They claim that the Baltic countries are paranoid. They're accused of being Russophobic, which is a theme that comes back often with the messaging. They also claim that NATO is unwelcome, that troops are occupants. They claim that it is obsolete, that it cannot protect its allies. So most of the messaging actually use those terms. So they also say that the Baltics are artificial countries, not reliable partners, etc. But the last one, the one that really surprised me, because it's not something we're used to here in Canada and being accused of, is NATO, the Baltic, all the countries in the coalition, including us. Apparently, they claim we support often Nazi ideology. And I thought that was really surprising, but it came often in the interviews I conducted. So to explain quickly the purpose of the mission, in the Baltic countries, they joined NATO around 2004. We have troops mainly deployed there in the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group, which is a battle group that's multinational. It includes members from many nations, but they work under a host nation brigade. The strategic objective is really to deter from aggression. It may appear strange, but in that country, we have both people deployed and we have people posted that actually live there with families and all. So it's a very friendly environment with the host nation. The other country, it's not a member of NATO, as we said before. At the strategic level, the intent is to show that they're not alone. At the tactical level, they put emphasis on increasing operability, a word I cannot pronounce in English, and coming towards the West. As an example of all the military initiative, they're trying to, there was a lot of effort put to create a training center, like a collective training center like we have in Canada and the US, where you can pass a brigade or a battle group into that area. As you saw previously, getting closer to the West is what the narrative is directed towards hindering. In an ideal world for them, to support their messaging, that country goes back after trying the West and decides that the West not good enough. So that's really what the messaging and all the narrative being used is targeted towards. In the training mission, we have a few hundreds of soldiers, which is not a lot, but it's I think they're doing quite a good job. So so now we're coming to what exactly was the risk. The quantity of events that affected our troops was way lower than expected, because you know as well as I do that when there's something happens, everybody talks about it and it gets dramatic, and we all think all our soldiers' family are being contacted at home and they are repeatedly being harassed, etc. So it by checking like both places what's going on really on the ground, it was interesting to see that it's not that bad, which I will come back to later. So of course there's spied to up to a point. It would be boring if they were not. There have been cases of stolen material such as computer, but no loss of important information. Fortunately, none of our soldiers from our contingent was physically harmed. It might have happened to other contingent, but not ours. There also been hacked, but not as much as I would have thought. Leaking of information happened, but it was more leaking than it was hacked. So even one of the commanding officers was joking because a list of his personnel arriving was published in the media, and he was not on it. So he said that he felt unimportant because he didn't make the cut. So so it's not those are like they're not huge things. So but the use of media is the one that's really important because, as mentioned earlier on, it's directed at NATO. In there, we did have a few incidents directed at Canada. For example, when our troops arrived in the Baltics, there were articles kind of comparing all Canadians to a former Air Force colonel who was sadly found of killing women. So that came back. That was old news from 2009, 2010. It was used against us. So the actions that the adverse party are taking, they're not that big, they're small. So colleagues compared that to throwing spaghetti on the ceiling and see what's going to stick. They're very patient. They don't mind if it catches or not because there's so many small attempts that eventually, like something's going to stick, and that one, they will put emphasis on it and they will distribute it and see if they can do damage to the coalition with it. So over there, the interesting thing is the local population is actually used to it. Our population, not so much. And in North America, we could say that patience is not really what we're famous for, I'd say. And as people, not just as the military, I'm really thinking as people. So we're very quick to react, or we really want reactions really quick. So I believe these are our biggest disadvantages because accusations occur. We want to react right away, call them off. It's a lie, you know. despite the fact that sometimes that will just keep the topic on the news longer. There have been a lot of cases in the past where no reaction was the correct reaction. And I had other examples, but they're from the years we were in Afghanistan. So the biggest incident that I wanted to talk about, it's one that I did not expect, as mentioned before. So what happened is there was an embassy initiative. It was led by a local Jewish community. It was an effort of reconciliation between circa World War II different groups that were totally in opposition. To give more examples. So pictures were taken. For some reason, one of these pictures did not have the organizers in it. So you could not see that it was sponsored by a Jewish community over in this country. Unfortunately, that was used by Adverse News to claim that Canadian officials honor Nazi collaborators in Ukraine, angering Jewish groups. So the most interesting fact in this story was that the local media did not react. The article was barely tweeted 200 times. Basically, not a big deal over there. But what was really interesting is how it did get picked up and where it got picked up. So in Canada, a journalist saw that from the other country's news, published it really quick, and then another in a serious newspaper. Then it got picked on another online magazine type platform, and it was now shared. And it reached a point where people in Canada believe that we were seen over there as Nazi sympathizers. To be clear, that's not ever something we get called in Canada. It's not normal to be called that. So the members on the pictures were basically the ones most affected, because either the members or their families, because they got asked questions and had to justify, and so the government had to answer, etc. Fortunately, what happened, which is really interesting because it gives a picture of how to fix problems sometimes with fake news, is there's a strong community from that country in Canada. And the people whose origins are from that country saw through it right away. So they realized that made no sense. And they started contacting the journalists to ask them to actually correct what happened, the information, because it was false. So it was really, I think that was better coming from that community than us officially calling that a lie. So because I think accusing of lying is way less efficient than showing the truth by our action. Of course, false stories are also recycled years later, which is another difficult one to address. I believe that's an area where we have to be very imaginative. We have to conduct also proper analysis, because actions are often a stronger message than a spoken message itself. I was really glad to hear Colonel Merkins address truth and the people in his presentations, because we tend to see things at a higher level and often forget the impact on the ground. And now the strategic and the tactical gets mixed so often together that it's important to see the people piece. So I said it wasn't that bad. I really think it wasn't that bad. There must be reasons. The first one, I want to acknowledge that our people were not the main target audience. So that does help. However, I do believe that we did a few things right too. And I think that's where the area of solution and research will be important in the future. A lot of effort went into the training with regards to the risk our troops were facing. The briefs were not just given as usual. I don't know if it's the same in your countries. I suppose it is. So when you're trying to go on a mission, you all sit in a big room and for hours and hours of PowerPoints, and most people don't get too much. So what we did, instead of train the trainer and then like the chain of command will give the brief and it gets diluted, they used subject matter experts that were really understanding of what the risks were on those topics, and briefed our members, and even included preparing them from cyber aspects and all that. So I was also very impressed that despite the lack of a dedicated cell, because one of the things I forgot to mention was there was no cell of influence activities over there. So our people in command, they understood perfectly well the situation and that the mission was about more than just training, for example, or the show of force in the other one. They understood that the presence of our troops transcended the exercises or the training provided. So some of them went as far as, for example, if their job was to conduct training, they would move the training from a base where no one would know about it to a place where they would show a bigger Canadian posture with the country they were in. So I think I think that helped a lot. Of note also that one of them was qualified, I know for sure, information operations course from a few years ago. So those are all the kind of things that can help our commander to be more to know more about those things. Also, at the very super micro tactical level, a higher level of responsibility is put on our troops. They must travel often, and in little groups without close supervision. While at first, for force protection reasons, they were not necessarily in uniform, but commanders realized very quick that they were missing an opportunity to actually represent our objectives and to be closer to the public. So they did put the emphasis on all the movement between tasks to be in uniform. Adding to this, the soldiers were strongly encouraged to become actively involved in the community. That's another piece that went extremely well because they became taken by supporting various causes, involved in charity, etc. Even another Canadian thing to do, they got involved in hockey games and all those things, and it contributed to be really close to the host nation, especially in a country that's an ally. So some commanders even got involved with the academic side of the country where they were, giving presentations in universities, for example. Another one who did a phenomenal job over there. It was super interesting because he had an ancestor from the country, and he took the time to actually go in that area and explain that his family came from there and became closer to that village, and they were really happy about that. So the other piece that we see often in an information environment, which is fascinating, is social media. Social media was the same, but is facing issues because people are so briefed on the importance of security that there's a reluctance, of course, in Canada to use social media as an organization. Fortunately, this has moved forward. The different task force have a bigger footprint. They're able to communicate on the means used locally, but also to inform our people at home. So the impact varies, though, depending on the platform. Some are more popular than others. And also, I find even at home, on our own age bracket, we sometimes assume that our social media is the one everybody uses, and we're often outdated. As I mentioned earlier on, though, one of the things we had to be careful with was mistakes, especially misbehavior, because it gives adverse media opportunity to build messaging against our troops. So the good behavior and the discipline did help actually the mission. Various commanding officers told me that as soon as something they considered unacceptable, and I'm just talking about like overuse of alcohol, they would be sent on a plane home. So the troops were clearly briefed that whatever they did that was lacking discipline, it gives an inch to the adverse side to be used against the mission, and that they don't want to put the mission at risk. So the soldiers got pretty good at it. So I went really quick because that's how I speak usually. But in conclusion, training. We have to see it in the military, but also beyond. I'd like to reiterate the importance of the training aspect in order to prepare our troops for the area they'll be living. While well prepared for the info environment threat, one of the comments that still came from one of the guys was there could have been more training on the cultural awareness, though. So that would be one that to be improved, to be even more efficient on the ground. A key point that's also important to highlight is the effect produced on a target audience. It's not clear to me that our population reacts rapidly to other government attempts, including fake news, especially by comparison to the local population where the members were deployed. This point was brought actually about Sweden earlier on, so I was really happy about that. Some of our journalists did not validate the sources of the material they publish. I don't know if it's because the news cycle's too quick or just a lack of ethics. It's not my job neither to find that out, but the result is the same. It does have an impact on our mission. The examples such as the accusations of Canadian soldiers being Nazi supporters barely got bandwidth locally. When it made no sense at home, the people was quick to believe that over there, they would believe it. So I see irony in that, because our population think they will believe. However, their population, unlike ours, teaches children about fake news. They do teach them about protecting their information means and all those aspects. So I believe that education is an area that will play a really important role at home. However, the problem we have is it's not a military responsibility. Therefore, it will be important to establish the right networks with other government departments and even civil society organizations. This is a massive point, as the reaction at home often has a huge impact on where we're deployed. We may not get involved or in a project or an action we should be taking sometimes because of the fear of the perception back home. So that's why I think that we have to find ways to actually make the people at home realize what the situation is. So positive results on the ground came from increasing our visibility within both countries, wearing uniform, like I said before, getting involved with local youth, NGOs. All that contributes to support the purpose of the troops, which reinforces the strategic objectives. Some relationships over there were so solid that when I spoke to one of the commanders who came back last fall, he was telling me about another guy who was still famous over there, so how much he had brought to the country and was well respected in the area from over 2 years ago. Again, about social media, despite certain risks with regards to social media, with the right training and the right measures to prevent attacks, these tools can be instrumental in the accomplishment of the mission. I'd simply say that we have to make sure the individual protects their own means, but we can't be afraid of using them for our organization. The things we have to check when we use it from an organization perspective, though, is doing the correct analysis and look at the desired and not desired effect that can occur, and be ready that if the non-desired effect occurs, to be ready for the next round and to answer to that. Finally, I believe that strong training and strong leadership with the right mindset is contributing to reassure the population in the areas our soldiers are deployed. The trust those soldiers were given also increased, in my opinion, their level of discipline. While they were at risk on a personal level, things went generally well and made the experience positive. From a military perspective, an improvement would certainly be a cell to add to their ORBAT with the right tactical CIMIC and PSYOPs as a force multiplier, yes, but also everybody in a key role has to be the right people. And that we often forget that talent management piece, I find. So to really conclude, I'd like to say that this topic was really fun to work on because everybody I spoke to was so enthusiastic about their mission. They were actually ecstatic. The ones that are still there don't want to come back. It's really interesting to be in a country where the host nation is actually happy to see our people. Yes, there's sometimes a few elements that are not that, they're more surprised, but mainly it's all positive stuff, and it was that was really interesting. It's also my intent was to bring the discussion to a more tactical level, to be able to give more human and human-driven examples. I hope this fitted well with your expectation. I'm looking forward for more discussions in these topics in the future because I do believe they're going to be very present in the future. The end.
Well, thank you for your
The end.
thank you for your presentation. Now let's have a conversation about it. It was a great topic because this was a theme that came across from each one of the previous presenters, and you were able to take it to a tactical level. So I have two comments, and then there's a series of questions behind me, and then I'll cap it off. The first one is, I think sometimes we make our adversaries 10 feet tall. I'm a career intelligence officer, so I was taught to do that from a young age. I'll remind everybody that the way we knew the Russians had really gone into the Western Ukraine was their soldiers were using Facebook, taking pictures of themselves, and we were able to track them across Russia to their assembly areas and then across into Western Ukraine. So they're as vulnerable to these tools as we are. It's just maybe they're more willing to use them. Or it's a little bit different. So you talked about their methodology of, you called it throwing spaghetti against a wall, but multiple threat vectors, different messages, looking for what works, and then if they think it's working, potentially try to exploit that. That's a lot different than most Western doctrine on information operations. Because we have a lot of artillery officers. I don't know if you're an artillery officer. Artillery officers think about this like we think about shooting artillery, which is you would never spray the area with artillery. You have to be precise. So I think one thing we ought to ask ourselves about our approach in doctrine, if we're doing this, is the methodology being used against us more effective than what we use in our environments, which is this idea that we have to know the target, we think we have to know the outcome, we have to have precision, and then we fire and hopefully it meets its intent. I offer that just as thought. If you have a comment on that, that's fine. If not, we have a series of questions for you. Yeah.
G'day. First up, apologies. I've been a belligerent Australian asking questions on Twitter all the time. I promise only do it 5 or 6 more times. You know, Canada is a really interesting problem, and I'd like to hear your perspective. You talked a lot about the Baltics, but I guess continually you have to look a little bit more towards the Indo-Pacific and some of the challenges you're facing with belligerents like China. Recently, there was an incident where the Canadians arrested one of the Huawei senior representatives, and then subsequently you had some government representatives arrested in China as well. Canada is one of those few countries, I think, that faces that challenge of looking both east into the Baltics, like you said before, but continuously west into the Indo-Pacific, and those challenges that we're sort of facing in the Indo-PACOM. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you're trying to cope with both looking left and right and some of those emerging challenges you might be seeing, say, in the Indo-PACOM as well.
That's a very interesting question because before last week, I'd say we look way more to Europe and the Middle East more than actually Asia. And I was at a conference this weekend where, fortunately, our scientists are also looking at the Asian piece of that. The situation that happened is interesting also with the phone. I can't comment on it because it's not my area of expertise. I will only say that I will not buy their phone. And my staff wish we could tell the Canadian public not to buy that stuff, but it's beyond our responsibilities. But yeah, we're starting to be more interested also looking at what's going on the Asian side. I was sitting on a presentation that was comparing both the situation in Russia and in China. There is their interests are a little different in the sense that vis-a-vis the control on the population and all. But I think we're from where I sit, we didn't look at it enough, actually.
Colonel LaMarre, two questions. One from online. Based on the briefs and your presentation, would you say that a big part of the future OE will be battling IO in the home front, specifically domestic military installations and on SCADA systems?
What was the last word you said?
So SCADA, it's an American acronym for Supervisory Control
Okay.
and Data Acquisition. It's the automated
Okay.
controls for power plants.
Okay. Sorry. Questions and translation in my head. It takes a moment. I'm trying to go back. I'm sorry. Can you ask it again? I'm sorry. I missed that. Ask it again. I'm
No
sorry,
worries,
I
ma'am.
missed that.
So the question is, we were focusing mostly on deployed forces
Yeah.
in the Baltics, but what about the vulnerabilities in the future on the domestic front, both at military installations
Okay.
within Canada and the troops and families there, as well as the infrastructure and plant
Okay,
inside?
that's difficult because when we go on the home front, it's not necessarily a national defense thing. So that's why I said in my presentation that we have to put more networking between other government departments as a whole of government approach. We're not conducting anything in Canada, but my big point was that even if we would not target, of course, our population. The problem, though, is our population, when it's being targeted, it has effect on our operations. So we have to find ways to inform our population, but with the help of the other departments. And that's where this is very popular discussion. But it also, I think it was mentioned earlier on, it's when you're in what they're starting to call the gray zone, it's more difficult to know what the government can do without the population misinterpreting what the government is willing to do. I hope that was clearer. Clearer.
Thank you, ma'am. And one of the previous presenters, Dr. Lipke from the Bundeswehr, was wondering if you could imagine using these instruments of information warfare in an offensive role employed by NATO members.
I think so. I think for in a defensive role, we have a lot of things to do. We forget sometimes because information operations is starting to be more popular as if it was a new thing. But we've been very successful in the past. For example, psychological operations was used even in the I would say World War I and II, but even long before that. Also, just in Afghanistan, our influence activities were really used in full spectrum targeting. So I'm thinking whether it's defensive or offensive, I don't see why we would not be able to use the only thing is on our own land. Most of our tools, we have to have ministerial approval should anything happen on our soil, which is okay because we don't want our population to think we're targeting them anyways.
Yeah, I think that's really very common in our democracies as far as where our authorities are to operate and for those exact reasons. But it's also a seam that is an advantage for the adversary. I will say that in each of the cases I've heard about the use of information operations, we're looking at the here and now. And there's a real potential with the continued development of artificial intelligence to come at populations, military families, deployed soldiers with more content across different mediums at a speed where it's going to get very difficult to determine what is true. We've all heard of deep fakes, but they're very clumsy right now. They're only going to get better. And the use of different types of artificial and different types of augmented realities and virtual realities is going to really come at all of our senses as humans. You know, it's just not going to be a see and hear. Potentially, you're going to be able to see, hear, feel, and smell, and have multi-sensory things coming at you. So this is a real scene for the future operational environment. I mean, have you thought through? Because we're looking from here to 2040. this is only going to get more complex to
But
mitigate.
I agree with you, because to give you an example, there's a reason I did not name the two countries I was talking about, not because it was classified. Our presence there is absolutely open. It's just that I'm already thinking when I'm giving a presentation that it can be used and chopped and reused by adverse means. So I think when we're there, it's we have to get better at that was the education piece I was touching, getting better as both the military from a professional point of view, but also as citizens at debunking the fake news. I was told in Finland they have a TV show at night that goes through fake news to explain them. So I think we all have to be collectively more aware of what's going on.
Yes, and the Swedish officer had mentioned it,
Yeah.
Sweden and Finland, because this problem is zero for them because of where they sit geographically. But in the virtual world, geography doesn't have a lot of importance in this case. So I think that's pretty interesting. And I think a lot of what you talked to, we've always said that warfare is about will of people and the cognitive domain. And we might discover that the problem we're talking about that's been shared, with all the different countries, this isn't a surprise, but this might be the decisive fight of the future. It might not be tank on tank. That could happen, but that might be just as an aside as the decisive fight, which is focused on our leaders, our formations, potentially our families, our populations. So I think you bringing it to a tactical level has been very helpful. I think that's it for our questions today, Lieutenant LaMarre, and it's been appreciate you spending time with us and what your Army's been doing in the Baltics and in the Ukraine as you continue to develop this. I can say it, and I read the news. I know you're there, so it's not a big deal. So that's great. I would hope that you would listen in. We have already proclaimed you an Army mad scientist. You'll be getting the documentation in the mail. You're not alone. There are other Canadian Army mad scientists, but they're not a lot. So you're in a selective few, and we appreciate that time with you. We will do everything we can do to make sure you don't become a deep fake once they pull you off of YouTube, but I can't promise that. So we'll see how that goes. I would share, if you go to the MadSci lab, I hope you've seen that page. On the right side, we have a survey running. I would hope you would share that survey, take it, share it with your teammates, and share with us what you think about the future and the ideas of the future. And keep listening today. And if you have questions, you can be like Dr. Lipke from Germany that slid right in. Good for him, because it's late at night in Germany, and he slid right in with a question. So that's great. For us in this room and for everybody else in the virtual community, we're going to take a short 10-minute break, and we're going to set up and come back, and we're going to have a NATO discussion, which is very interesting because a lot of the people we've had talk to us are from member nations. But we're going to have a discussion a little bit around NATO as NATO is looking at the operational environment for 2024.